I've had these Harbor Freight tap and die sets for years and have found them to be a very good value because they are cheap and fairly complete. The problem I have with them is that the die handles are absolute garbage. I'm honestly not even sure how they expect you to use these things. The die retention screw threads into the extremely soft, thin metal of the holder, and as soon as there is any resistance, the threads bend and strip, and then nothing will ever stay snug in the handle again. On one of these, I sized up the threads and used a different screw, but it quickly failed again in the same way. To top it off, these are round dies, which are not uncommon, but I'm not a big fan because without a die holder, there's really no good way to use them. I have semi-successfully held these in a vise before, but it tends to want to squish the die before holding it still, and there is a lot of trial and error and fiddling involved. I do have a handful of other dies, and I always go for the hex design if it's an option, but these aren't exactly cheap. 3 or 4 of those cost about as much as both of these sets combined. And when you need an uncommonly used size or pitch, having a complete set on hand can really be a lifesaver. So what I would like to do is have a nice solid handle to use with these sets of round dies. There are quite a few inexpensive options out there, but it would be nice to have one that fits these exact dies snugly without the need for adjustment screws. These Harbor Freight dies all follow metric sizing, having an outer diameter of 25mm and not the common 1 inch that a lot of the quality die holders are built to use. I'd also really like to have the ability to clamp the handle in the vise, which most don't easily allow. So, for those reasons, and just because I want to, we're going to have a go at making a die handle from scratch. Digging around for materials, I pulled out this, a chunk of 1/2 inch thick 6061 aluminum that was previously carved up to make a supercharger idler bracket. We're going to take this 2.5 inch hole saw through there in order to cut out a disc that we can mount in the lathe. It would be easier just to start with a round stock, but this is what I had sitting around and it's a figure it out as we go sort of day, so I think it'll work. Basically, we need a little pocket for the dies to sit in, a set screw to hold them in place, and we're going to cut the heads off to 5/16 inch bolts to use as removable handles. To get started with the aluminum section, we'll use the drill press. Well, maybe not. That belt has been getting pretty bad, should probably replace it someday. Today though, the old trusty, thoroughly abused DeWalt drill did the job and only let out the usual amount of smoke. So now we've got a roughly cut out aluminum puck that's ready to visit the lathe. We'll sit that in the chuck as flat as possible, give it a facing pass, drill the center out to 1/2 inch, turn the inner diameter out to 3/4 inch, and then, leaving a shallow shoulder, bring the inside to 25mm, checking for a snug die fit as we go. Finally, we'll add some chamfers before flipping the big shiny washer over to face the back of it, really just for aesthetics. Just to be on the safe side, I went through and dropped every one of these dies into the holder, and they all fit nice and snug, which is great news. That's most of the functional part taken care of, and the rest of the build doesn't require nearly as much precision, so out comes the angle grinder. After a pair of cuts to make 2 flat, parallel faces, we'll use the disc sander to do the rest of the shaping and leave the once round holder with 8 sides. We'll bolt that to a 1-2-3 block to hold it upright and drill a pair of 17/64 holes for the handles to mount in, being careful not to break through into the inner diameter. Finally, we'll add 2 more 13/64 holes for a set screw. The plan is to just use one, but we may as well leave the option for an addition later. All the holder needs now is a bit of threading, but before we get to that, we're going to veer off course for a little side project. Back at our Harbor Freight tap and die sets, the die handles are trash, but the tap handles are serviceable. As long as there's enough space to use them, I like the design of these universal style wrenches, but the ones in the kit are a little cheesy and only useful for a somewhat narrow range of sizes. I bought this Irwin one a while back, and while I do like it overall, especially for the price, I found that in order to get the tap to confidently stay put, it needs a little extra leverage on the tightening handle. What I have been using is an Allen key, which works, but I think we can make something a little more civilized. We previously modified a screwdriver to make a more pleasant chuck key, which has been working great despite some grip deterioration, so it seems like another spare driver from that same set should make for a nice, comfortable tap handle tightening tool, once we make a few minor alterations. Back on the lathe, we'll chuck that up and see how stable it is, and it's workable, so we'll turn down the diameter of a section at the center of the steel shank until it's just about right to fit in the tap wrench. That should get us close enough, and once we trim off the unneeded screw driving part, we'll make a quick pass on the sander to finish off this basic tool. All it needed to be was the right diameter to fit the tap handle, and the small shoulder keeps it from sliding around. It's a nice, snug fit, and the setup seems like it should work without any problems. Care should be taken not to over-tighten it, of course, and I'm not sure if the screwdriver shank or part of the tap handle would fail first, but as long as we are reasonable, I doubt we'll find out. Okay, back to what we were supposed to be doing. We'll use a nice, secure 5/16 by 18 tap to cut threads for the die handles, and after a nice and easy change to a 1/4 inch 20 tap, we're left with a place for the set screw to call home. Finally, we'll make the handles by cutting a few threads off a pair of bolts before beheading them and rounding the ends over with the help of our long-suffering drill, and give just a hint of a point to the socket cap screw that will hold the dies in place. After all that futzing about, here's the finished product waiting to be assembled. The handles have hex nuts to lock them against the die holder, but also allow them to be easily removed, and once the set screw is in place, we can drop in a die and snug it up. Yeah, that's about all there is to it. It's a bit bulky, maybe, but definitely an improvement over the useless ones that came with the sets, and hopefully a decent pairing with the Irwin tap wrench. Two questions though: is the aluminum holder strong enough, and is that screw up to the task of holding the die in place? Our challenger is a common 5/16 by 18 grade 8 bolt, chosen specifically because I have tried to use a die to extend the threads on one of these before, but wasn't able to hold everything in place to do it. 1/4 inch grade 8 was the previous maximum, and even then it was a struggle. Keeping the bolt oiled and taking our time, the die had no trouble at all dicing up the hardened steel and cutting threads all the way to the underside of the bolt head. It was by far the easiest time I've ever had with any round die. I'm quite satisfied with that, and even though the threads on the bolt may not be picture perfect, they are completely usable. Even after all that back and forth, the die is still totally locked in and didn't need any retightening during use. Is this going to stand up to abuse and survive forever and ever? Maybe not, but for as often as I use these dies, I think it'll be just fine. Even if we consider that I'll probably use them more now that I can. We're also able to remove the handles in order to use it in a somewhat tight space, allowing us to grab it with a wrench. Oh, that's a design flaw. Well, really anything can grab the two flats and turn it manually. It can also be clamped in the vise, like so, because sometimes it's more convenient to thread a part into a die. This way, we have a bunch of options for actually using our vast collection of Harbor Freight dies. On top of entirely removing the handles, we could always switch them out for shorter or longer bolts, and after filming the majority of this video, I ended up adding rubber hose to the handles, which made them substantially more comfortable. And yeah, somebody in the comments may have seen this. I'm not totally sure what happened there, but I think the first set screw I put in bound up on some debris left in the threads, and after a large amount of force trying to loosen it, it broke off in there, so I cut it flush and used the threaded hole on the opposite side that someone had helpfully thought to include. I just didn't think I would need it so soon. Despite some imperfections, I'm really happy with the new additions to the tool collection. I've already used the tap wrench tightener a ton, and it was well worth the small amount of time it took to make it. Even for the simple stuff, there's just nothing like the satisfaction of using something you made yourself.